Thank you for joining me, Mukesh Kapila, to breathe life into fading causes. Humanitarianism, much challenged nowadays, is still a growth industry, with needs around the world exploding over recent decades. We now have thousands of humanitarian organizations, all of them doing their bits of good. And each agency, whether it's a UN agency or a Red Cross, Red Crescent, or an NGO, has its own personality and place, collaborating and competing in equal measure in the crowded marketplace of misery alleviation. And their acronyms have entered daily language. One such acronym is MSF. And you don't need any French to understand that this stands for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. I've seen MSF's work in many countries, always admiringly, although sometimes with exasperation, because they can appear somewhat arrogant. But MSF revels in its reputation as an irritant of the humanitarian system, of which it is an indispensable part. My guests will explain why the world needs even more of the special iconoclastic style of MSF. He is the Director General of MSF's Operations Center in Geneva, having earlier served as the Executive Director of MSF Canada. Stephen Cornish, welcome to Fading Causes.
Mukesh, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to the opportunity of pulling back the curtains on some of the less understood choices that our organization makes, as well as the reflection that goes into those choices. They're never easy, but I hope to elucidate a little bit on that.
Great. Look forward to an interesting discussion. The culture of any organization is shaped by its DNA. As must also be, in your case, it was founded in Paris in 1971 in the aftermath of the Biafran Nigerian Civil War. Many French doctors went there and did with the Red Cross, but then they fell apart. What was a disagreement, and why did they feel it necessary to create MSF as an independent new organization?
Those early doctors at Biafra, witnessing unimaginable suffering and hunger, started to get frustrated with the limitations on advocacy by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is with the parties to the conflict. And it's very important. They're mandated to improve the conduct of the belligerents and to ensure the protection for civilians and for humanitarian access. And those doctors realized that it wasn't only the ICRC blocking them, but we were in the Cold War period where states defined good and bad victims, those that we cared about, like in Vietnam, and those that we didn't care about, like in Biafra. In fact, not only was it statesmen, but also the media not covering things in the way that these doctors were seeing. And so they started to organize. They spoke also with journalists, psychologists, and others. And they decided that we needed a new humanitarianism that put the victim as center, and that there would not be good and bad victims, only victims' rights and the right to medical attention, to the basic building blocks of life. And that came as the genesis of MSF. That's what led to one of the founding principles, and it's in our name. This without borders doesn't come from nowhere. It's to ensure that government decisions that closed borders, that disappeared crisis, will not be only decided upon by governments who allow or block access, but that we would go across borders, because the right to medical assistance has no borders, and every person deserves to have the basic building blocks of life.
5 decades later, we're having the same debates. Let me just pick up one aspect, and that is, what do you think by staying silent to maintain services, access to victims, or speaking up and possibly being thrown out, as has happened to you in several places? You have this interesting explanation, what you call témoignage, which is French for bearing witness and speaking out. But what are your internal MSF debates around this? And can you give some examples of speaking out and the consequences of that? How do you, as operations chief, decide when to speak up and when not?
Well, it's not just my decision. These decisions are made by committee, and we don't always come to consensus. But we try to keep the medical ethic, which is central to our work, as part of the deliberation. Is our presence doing more harm than good? Would more harm than good come if we were gone? If we're there, are we being used, instrumentalized? And there's always some instrumentalization. But in some cases, if that presence is so manipulated that there is not independence of action and right to assist, then that's when those questions arise. And some examples practically. One is in Goma after the genocide in Rwanda, where there were sprawling camps with hundreds of thousands of people, horrendous conditions. cholera outbreaks that were killing people like flies. And the debate started to occur within the organization because they saw that much of the assistance was governed and decided on by the génocidaires who had fled Rwanda. And on the other side, people were saying, yes, but if we're not here doing our bit, then there'll be tens of thousands of more deaths. So what do we do? And these debates went right up to the top of each of the boards of the independent MSFs. Everyone struggled with it. So we didn't reach agreement, and some left and some stayed. And they're very difficult. How do you judge the principle of humanity versus that of independence or that of being used? They're very, very tricky and decisions that have real world consequences on the ground.
So you also have committees inside your iconoclastic organization. Curious to know whether committees make good decisions. I'm asking that as the bureaucracy of committees is a bane of our life.
Yeah, I'll say that it's a disorganized, chaotic set of voices, and we encourage people to speak out, right from those who are on the ground all the way up the chain of command. After every incident, we do a review to learn and improve. We're very self-flagellating, but I'll give you an example of when the committee works and maybe one less so. In this case, it was the international board of MSF that each MSF has a representative on that started to add up all of the incidences, the kidnappings, the killings that we'd had in Somalia, which the operational people may not have that breadth of time. And the people on the ground, of course, see the suffering. They're not going to want to leave no matter what. They'll try to work around it. But at that time, the international board heard all the history and looked and discussed. And they said, actually, the conditions to operate safely, effectively, and independently no longer exist. And until such time as we can renegotiate our presence with the various actors in Somalia, we should withdraw. And so they gave us the signal that we'd gone over the line, leading to the withdrawal of MSF's presence in Somalia for several years. But also it came with a plan of how to re-engage. And so some of the MSFs were given the mandate to continue the discussions with Al-Shabaab and others to find ways to work safely and effectively. They started slowly with doing remote programs, and we're now back in Somalia. But that's an example where the committee structure worked efficiently. In the earlier example around Goma, the committee ended up with different decisions. So it's not like every time there's an ethical decision, it goes all the way up the chain of command. Normally, the various MSF sections are working out their security, safety of patients, of our medical positions, as well as the independence we need to judge who needs assistance more, what type of assistance is necessary, and where can we bring it. Normally, we work that out by ourselves, but sometimes it's good to have a committee that can help to hold us to account because we can get lost in the suffering and just the desire to want to save lives at all cost.
Well, you're certainly self-flagellating, and that's quite endearing. Remember going to chapters where I was invited to give some keynote address, and I'm trying to be very nice to them, but they were so self-critical, I had to become some kind of psychotherapist, really, telling your members, hey, it's okay, you're not that bad, you're doing great, calm down. Anyway, you explained the ethos of the Sans Frontières, and you know that you've been copied. We now have veterinarians Sans Frontières and pharmaciens Sans Frontières, reporters, aviation Sans Frontières, telecoms, and God knows what else, even libraries, bibliothèques Sans Frontières. What do you think of all the cloning of your distinctive Sans Frontières concept?
I think we're actually thrilled with the copying of the model, so long as it isn't overlaying with the pure medical angle that we do, because we don't want confusion with our name, with our logo, with our brand, because our logo, in fact, is our protection and security. It's very visible, very well known, as you know, from having worked in many of these places. And so as long as there's no confusion over who we are and who they are, we're thrilled that the model has outgrown us. And we rely sometimes on some of these other Sans Frontières. There's Aviation Sans Frontières that has helped us with airlifts. We even had recently Clowns Without Borders, bringing smiles to children in camps in Chad that had fled Sudan. And that helps their emotional well-being and even recovery from potential PTSD. So we think there's lots more room for empathy, lots more room for sans frontierism. We draw the line, though, if it's looking to copy our medical work and use our name in a way that might create confusion.
Speaking of copying, I see the window behind you. You could throw a stone at your friends in the World Health Organization a few hundred meters down from you. Of course, people who live in glass houses should not cast stones. But tell me, what's the difference between the principles of neutrality and impartiality as practiced by MSF and as practiced by other bodies, say WHO, because you all subscribe to the same principles in theory? Can you give examples of how these principles work out in practice and how they're the same or different from other humanitarians?
There's two schools of thought on the application of principles. There's an orthodox model that resembles the International Committee of the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières. And there's a more permissible model seen by others, many of whom either have humanitarian and development outcomes, or who have internationally recognized mandates as UN organizations, where their presence is predicated on partnership with governments and the limitations that working alongside government can bring. So there's a bit of a straitjacket. It's easy to criticize and throw stones, but we actually need all of these different actors on the ground, each carrying out their own role. When it comes to MSF, we're quite strict with trying to follow the principles. But of course, the principles are always in danger themselves. They're always being eroded. And we have to make decisions on what we will accept. When do we accept a little bit less control, a little bit less access, a little bit less the ability to speak out that we mentioned before? We work effectively and long-standingly in several countries where we can't just speak out the way that we would like to publicly, where we do try it and discuss things behind closed doors, so long as we think we are improving and not doing more harm than good. A good example, perhaps, when we were in Syria conflict, there had been a number of chemical weapons attacks, and each side was blaming others, and no one was corroborating. We didn't feel that it would be wise for us to speak out on the chemical attacks at that time. So we took what you could call a less principled approach. We imported atropine to give to the clinics. We gave courses on how to protect yourself against chemical weapons. We brought in washing tents and really worked with medical facilities to prepare them to at least be able to provide the modicum of services and to protect themselves. And that lasted a number of months. Then the big chemical attack in Ghouta, where partners we had trained, worked with, and supplied received 6,000 patients in hours with the classic symptoms of poisoning. In fact, one volunteer died while giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to a patient, and immediately started the same blame game, each side blaming the other. There was no humanitarian space left, and so we felt like we had to speak out. But speaking out could have forced us out of the country from the Assad regime, could have led to retaliatory attacks against our staff or hospitals that we worked in. Or you remember at the time there was Obama's red line on the use of chemical weapons. So it could have led to U.S. big punishment attacks. And what do you do in such a situation? So we debated internally and knew that at that moment we had no option but to speak out, to at least show what we had witnessed and to put that on the record. We didn't blame one side or the other, but in the fog of war, propaganda is a big instrument. And if that attack had been allowed to go silent and said that it didn't even happen, there would have been no space for civilians, no space for medical activity. And so we felt, regardless of what consequence might come, that we had the moral obligation and responsibility to speak out.
I'm glad to hear that although you're principled, you're not rigid. If you can compromise, why did the compromises are principled? There has to be a reason why you compromise with greater good compared to not doing something. But you have another principle, that of independence. You're a fiercely proud and independent body, sometimes irritatingly so, as I found out many years ago when I was in the British government and UK being part of NATO. We bombed Saddam's northern Iraq because Saddam was doing terrible things to the Kurds. And after that, to pick up the pieces, we wanted humanitarian organizations to go in and help the Kurds and others. And in my experience, no humanitarian agency ever refuses a big fat check. But MSF did. They refused to accept our money on the grounds that they didn't want to ally themselves with NATO countries. So you went your own independent way. Can you explain what that means and how come you became so arrogantly independent to do away with government funds?
Well, I'll start by saying that at our beginning, we were somewhat less arrogant about our independence on financing. In fact, in the beginning, we relied much more heavily on government funding, and we tried to make a model where our funding would come from citizens who also had empathy and who also cared about what MSF cared about and our values. And that model became very successful. We have now 7 million supporters around the world that allow us the independence to work where we choose. And that's different than many organizations who are speaking about saying they have to take the check because they're places where they might want to work. But if the UK government doesn't want to, then they'll have no money, so they won't be able to. And so little by little, we reduced the funding that we took from institutions in order to uphold all of the other principles, to be impartial and bring aid where it's needed most, that we see as emergency, not that governments decide are emergent or not. And as a result, I do think we did become a bit arrogant, and so much so that we might have hurt ourselves a little bit, because the cost of bringing millions of supporters is not negligible. So $1 spent on fundraising, what does it bring back? That dollar spent on fundraising individuals costs a little bit more than getting a big fat check from the government, which has a much better return on investment. But we've decided that in areas of conflict, we can't afford to take that check, because what are the people on the ground, parties to the conflict, thinking? If we take money from the UK in the situation that you described, who's also part of the political and the military response, will that affect our access, our independence, our ability to be safely and securely working on the ground? And we believe it does. So now we have even less than 1% of government money. I think we could probably take more, but it's very important for those who can to maintain as much independence as possible. And we saw this also, Mukesh, and you'll recall clearly during the conflict in Afghanistan with the Taliban. The US was pushing very strongly that you were either for us or against us. And in fact, they made it illegal to discuss with the Taliban. And were throwing words like we were enabling terrorism by discussing with the Taliban. And then the language changed from one of security and defense over what happened in the US at 9/11 to one of democratizing the country and defending the rights of girls and women. That seemed like a good idea and a good trade-off to many organizations. Some went along because they thought it was a good trade-off. Some went along because they were dependent on that financing. At MSF, we chose not to. We continued discussing with the Taliban. Many of those activities that were linked to the military, they actually brought higher risk and harm to staff and patients, because the reason behind some of those aid posts and medical activities and feeding centers were to buy hearts and minds. And so as long as that continued positively, and if it had worked, maybe it would be a great success today. But in fact, that's not what happened. There was a change of who was winning and losing, and also in the interest of foreign parties. And then the memories of the Taliban were quite long. They judged those organizations they saw as independent and those who didn't. And the funds from those governments turned off. And so many organizations found themselves either unwelcome or without the funds to continue working. While we were able to stay, we're still there today. And we even run a full maternity staffed predominantly by women in Afghanistan, which is outside of the norms and the laws. But because of our stance, because of our medical principles, we've been able to carve out for now that space for women caregivers to take care of pregnant women, to deliver babies safely. And the people we discuss with, the Taliban, understand that they would want their baby to be delivered safely, that they would want vaccines for their children. Even while we were working during the American conflict, there was a blockade on Hazara Shah, and we were able to bring aid there across line. We were able to negotiate with individual Taliban leaders on the blockade to bring food, medicine, and vaccines for winter, because having those individual conversations with the commanders, they realized we would bring it to them, we needed to bring it to the others, and they all, of course, believed that children and women and civilians should have access to those basic building blocks of life.
So this is really commendable, because your financial arrogance, independence, means you have important operational independence, where other organizations who act like subcontractors to governments are not able to function. I suppose you really give meaning to the N in NGO. Is this going to be sustainable? Of course, you're wise now that the Americans have cut grants to all organizations. Presumably, with your 7 million donors, you are a little bit more insulated. But even mighty WHO and other UN agencies are pathetically looking for dollars and dimes in their public fundraising. In other words, they're competing with organizations like yours for the man or woman on the street. How are you going to keep your supporters in this more competitive public environment?
And we have a term for this called the changing humanitarian landscape, which sounds beautiful, but it's actually quite horrific, because along with the US cuts, most big European donors have also made substantial cuts. And even more tragically, we're seeing more and more of the funding removed from development programs towards humanitarian, which should be the short end of the stick. We want them to fund those other organizations. We need those partners on the ground. So who's filling those gaps when those organizations leave? Well, in many cases, it's MSF, whether that's malaria medicine in Madagascar, nutritious food in Plumpy Nut in South Sudan, vaccines in Chad, or water in the camps, where normally those activities end up being done by other NGOs or UN subcontractors. They're simply not able to continue. And so we're having to fill many gaps. But of course, our fundraising is not keeping up with that. So we'll have a moment of reckoning as well. These other organizations entering what we would have considered our market is certainly having an effect, because it's just like in economics. If more organizations are going to the same organizations that do these street canvassing and face-to-face, they'll increase their cost and demand. And it can lead to a saturation of individual markets. We look at new areas and new markets, global fundraising strategy. So we're raising funds in South Korea, in Brazil, but we're also having to diversify into cryptocurrency and Islamic financing and things of this nature. But at a certain stage, we'll also have to do less programs of choice to reduce our own costs, look at our efficiency, collaborate better with the system, with the Ministry of Health, with ourselves, and make tough choices. That global triage is not something I would wish on, but it's an exercise that we carry out every year.
This new tough world, as you call it, also a ruthless world, as we've alluded to. There is an interesting contrast, isn't there? Organizations of the UN system and the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement classify themselves as universalist. They have an imperative to work everywhere, in every country, in every community, in the case of the Red Cross, where there is need, which means that they sometimes compromise on their principles in a different kind of way and suffer criticism accordingly. But the criticism against you as a private organization is that you pick and choose where to work, or you withdraw from a situation where your conditions are not met, thereby leaving your beneficiaries high and dry. For example, in North Korea, you arrived in 1995 and left in 1998, even as people were still starving and eating grass, as I saw for myself at that time. I also remember, by the way, how you packed up your tents in Ruhengeri and walked away when you weren't allowed to operate freely in the hospital that you had opened after the genocide. So how has your policy evolved? How do you tackle the dilemmas of picking and choosing where to work in today's world where there are needs everywhere?
Well, that's a broad question. I'll try to give a few overlay points to start with. MSF doesn't take responsibility for the situation where we find ourselves. We are in the midst of unfathomable conditions, of unexplainable and unaccepted situations. And everywhere we go, we know we are not the answer to all of what's happening in a full country or a whole region. We're a part of the answer. And we use the medical angle and our testifying and advocacy to highlight that situation. We take responsibility for the patients that we can treat. So in a certain context, if we can treat 200,000, we will do everything for those 200,000 patients. But if we don't have the money or the capacity or the security to touch the 200,000 on the other side of that border, we won't do it. It pains us, but because we don't take the responsibility for the whole situation, even the people we save, the day after we save them, they can be killed by something else. We believe in their right to have assistance, but we also don't have a culture of martyrdom or international mandate. In the case of North Korea, you mentioned, had we had the ability to intervene independently, to bring food to those who needed it most, we would have stayed. But we could not bring food to those who needed it most. And we felt like we were perhaps bringing a fig leaf to the government and to the propaganda. Just like in the example I gave of Somalia, those decisions aren't put in stone forever. We generally try to get access, even if it's not to run a program in the time. We want to be able to have at least access when there is an emergency. So we continue the dialogue. We actually returned to North Korea several years after that, did tuberculosis work until COVID, and then all organizations were denied entry given the epidemic. And we continue to work on trying to go back to North Korea to this day. But the main thing is this triage, we have to do this on a regular basis. We try to set aside about 10 to 20% of our budgets to be able to respond to the emergencies that will be coming. Some may be a bit predictable. There are cycles of epidemics and tornadoes in certain places that generally crop up every year. but there are all kinds of other emergencies that are not plannable or conflicts which will erupt. And so we overlay an emergency threshold criteria. And this is very tough because when you're working in a situation of malnutrition or malaria and you bring things down to a bad normal where people are suffering and dying, but in small amounts, and you have to leave, it's heart-wrenching. But if we don't do that, we won't be able to respond to the things that go above the emergency threshold. Typically, we respond in the height of an emergency and then pass it on to either local actors, to other organizations for them to be able to continue things. But you can't always find that. And if we don't make those hard choices, we won't have the staff, the resources, the logistic capacities, etc., to respond where it's needed most. And that is still remains central to our ethos of being able to be present in emergencies, whether they're conflicts, disasters, and epidemics, as well as forgotten populations and diseases not treated, as we did in HIV/AIDS in South Africa, or as we do with having ships on the Mediterranean Sea, bringing attention to migrants and trying to hold the European government to account for what is happening because they are putting up walls, making inhuman conditions as a matter of policy. And so we use some of that response to hold a light to the consciousness, not only of the people in Europe, but also to their decision makers who we believe are making inhumane decisions.
That's a good point to talk about your work, you see, which I notice has been powerful in recent years. Last December, our international president briefed the UN Security Council on what he called the DRC's staggering violence. And he asked the members of the Security Council to think of patience and not just posture from their podiums. Good, stirring stuff, even though no one really thinks much of the Security Council. And earlier, as you mentioned, you castigated the European Union for their numerous failures on migration and also around Gaza. But isn't your political advocacy somewhat performative? Is anyone listening? It looks good on Instagram or whatever. But as I say, is it somewhat performative? How do you decide when and with whom to engage? Can you give examples of where you made a difference?
That's a pretty large question, too. And I won't hide that sometimes if you've tried everything and nothing works, we get frustrated. And sometimes it might seem that to speak out before leaving might assuage our own guilt or allow us to raise our voice. But I don't think that's the heart of our advocacy or our témoignage. I think you recall the words of our president, James Orbinski, when we received the Nobel Peace Prize. He said that doctors can't stop the conflict and that words may not save, but silence surely kills. And we truly believe that if we can bring our modicum of aid, but nothing changes around and no one takes responsibility, that's not enough. And so there are moments we come together collectively to speak out, sometimes to the highest level as the UN Security Council. We're cautious of where we bring our voice, to not bring it too often and to not be seen as conscripted by those actors or complicit. So there's always a debate on when we should speak out and with whom and where. But we try to bring the voices of the patients, the communities we work with, the realities that our field volunteers see on front of those who are responsible, because we don't have the answers to these things. And we don't believe that people should die and suffer in silence. A good example of where that voice has worked, Ebola epidemic in West Africa. We were on the ground. We have a strong experience in treating hemorrhagic fevers. Not many others did. In fact, at the beginning, even being able to protect our own staff and medical workers became an insurmountable challenge. We tried to do all the care we can for our staff. But in this severity of the epidemic, we had hundreds of patients coming into centers, and they became dying centers. And we knew that there was no way to protect everyone against that infection. And I said, we are the ones that have the responsibility. We're on the ground. We will accept this risk so long as we tell that risk to each of our staff members, and we will self-insure against it. And we blew the whistle on that epidemic months before anybody was willing to say it was going to be a global epidemic. And we were tooted and shooed away from other bodies. The reaction of the world community was to stop airlines shipping, stop volunteers from going. And we, and epidemiologists, know you cannot fight an epidemic by closing your door. You have to go towards the source, which is what we did in a very large scale. And we made mistakes. We lost some people. But over time, we coalesced and collaborated together, including with militaries, laboratories, other organizations, WHO, hand in hand. We trained many organizations. We opened up many university on how to react to Ebola. I was in Canada at the time, and our government was going to close the border. They didn't even realize we were working with one of the labs in Canada, the Winnipeg lab, that had been working in Ebola for many years. And it was only in our discussions they realized they already had more risk on the ground than they thought. But they were slamming the door. They were afraid that, like in the US, a doctor would come back and they'd have their own public health nightmare to deal with. We advocated directly with the Minister of Health. Her name was Rona Ambrose, and she changed the entire government's policy. They were going to lock the door, not send anyone, and instead they did just what we asked them to do. They put a campaign out to educate Canadians on why they had to send doctors. They made a partnership with the Red Cross and sent many Canadian doctors and facilitated assistance to go over. I think it's pretty clear the difference that advocacy made, changing our principles, if you like, because we accepted that we would lose some people and went anyway on a duty of care and informed consent.
Well, all I can say is that having personally witnessed your Ebola efforts in Liberia and Sierra Leone, they were just awesome. And your staff wrote a book afterwards on it, which I was pleased to write a few comments for. It really is an extraordinary testimony of public health heading into the unknown, and a story of enormous courage.
But there were also challenges, setbacks, disagreements, self-flagellation. We had the first experimental treatments and the first experimental vaccines. And one of those subcommittees on medical ethics chose not to use one of these experimental treatments on a member of our staff team or a partner organization. And that person died before we could evacuate them. We participated in the first trials of an experimental vaccine that the WHO had given authorization to do, and it was far more successful and actually proved to be one of the main tools that we rely on today. So it wasn't all beautiful, and we were criticized by some other organizations for therapeutic choices, etc. But that's when you walk into the unexpected and the unimaginable, and you do your very best. And again, we didn't take responsibility for the whole situation, but we did realize that it was a special moment where we had to step up and go above and beyond.
I think you put it very well. We need an independent MSF who will, if necessary, if science demands it, challenge the orthodoxy. That's also, I guess, part of your culture. Coming to culture, you have another interesting aspect. You call it no personal hero business. I'm struck that everybody knows what MSF, but you'd be hard-pressed to name anyone in it. I mean, who knows the name of your leader, or God knows how many leaders you have. And their social media followings are pathetic. A few thousand followers, maybe they're only friends and neighbors. The contrast is, for example, with the cults that have built up around the heads of humanitarian organizations elsewhere. And this is not necessarily a negative comment. I mean, our good friend Tedros has 2 million followers on X and is a household name, also leaders in other organizations. And not to mention the cults around philanthropists like Bill Gates. Do you think that such cultism around leaders of humanitarian organizations promote the humanitarian notion among the public, or does it hinder it? And what's the thinking inside MSF as to why you don't have this no hero cult policy?
Well, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. There are different styles and roles, and sometimes having a big public persona can be helpful. The musicians who got together for Band-Aid, for example. So if a public persona can instill change, action, or hope, that's positive. For us at MSF, it is our logo and our name that is our protection, that is our independence, that is our ability to work. And so we want the brand to be what you see and remember, not the face bringing the news. Sometimes with cults of personality, people start to become the subject of their reporting rather than the instrument. And we would like MSFers to truly be the instrument of bringing what we witness, see, and hear on the ground to the wider world. So much so that our leaders are mandated to turn over and do no more than 6 years in a position so that someone else can take that role. It's just the way we look at it is we don't want it to be individuals who are the message. We want the message to be associated with the people who gave us that message, with the medical activities that we've witnessed, and all too often with the atrocities seen. I want those to speak for themselves and not it to be a person who's remembered, but that it's the message.
That's very noble. And also in terms of protecting the cause, because we see examples where constraints have been personalized on individuals for example, the head of UNRWA or the head of the World Food Program in the early years of the Gaza problem. Coming to innovative work you've done on Ebola treatments at a time where there were none treatment. Another example I can vouch from personal experience was on trying out antiretrovirals on mobile populations, refugees in Kenya, in DRC, from Rwanda, who were dying of HIV caught through sexual violence. And everybody said, oh, you can't give antiretrovirals to them because you need laboratories, medical follow-up, etc. And you tried it and showed it saved many lives. And today it's normal practice. That brings me to the question, where do you get your science from? What's the research and innovation system in the MSF network, which advises on what to try out and where to innovate and how to then apply that on larger scale?
Well, it's an interesting question. Each of our operational centers has a medical committee that oversees ethics. We learn and listen to gaps and needs in the field. They watch the latest developments in the medical fields, and we'll try something preemptively because it sounds like a good idea. Ready-to-use nutritional food was one of those that our fields did the first testing. We have also a specialized center called Epicenter, where researchers, clinicians, and ethicists give us a hand so that when we do field trials, they can stand up to external scrutiny. And I'll go back farther even. Sometimes it's not even medical change. It's mental blockage. You spoke about HIV/AIDS treatments for migrant populations, but when there were medical treatments available, those were denied to what we labeled then the third world, and in fact, Europe and US clinicians warned against trying to treat people in Africa and in other less served areas, saying that there would be too high tallies of people withdrawing and lead perhaps to resistance that might affect their own medicines. So we did the first trials in South Africa and proved we had a better adherence than in richer countries. But it's a very difficult subject because we're also an organization of doctors. We like to follow the protocols laid down by the World Health Organization. And a good example with TB treatment for many years was directly observed treatment. So each medicine had to be watched by the clinician as it was given because there was such a fear that people would abandon the long, very difficult treatment. When people feel a bit better, they sometimes stop taking the treatment. And if you had a too high tally of people leaving, you could contribute to drug-resistant tuberculosis. And so we kept applying direct treatment, and then the people had to live in centers for 6, 9, 12, sometimes 18 months. And at the beginning, we would only do the medical part. And then we started looking at these centers, and some were in the ex-Soviet Union. They were not having proper food or heating, etc. And so we started to invest in the centers. And we still saw a high level of withdrawals. And so you start to question, do we stop this program? Are we doing more harm than good? And then it became evident by listening to the patients that they weren't able to support their families back home while they were sitting in these centers for so long. So then we started social assistance to the families, if that was the cause why people were leaving. And this went on for a number of years, and we still adhered strictly to the WHO protocol. Finally, we started to question the protocol itself. And we're a problem that we're keeping these people in these centers for this long, that's just not sustainable. And so we trialed a new system where you didn't have to live in the center all the time, and we could do the directly observed treatment either by a community health worker. And this is what really changed the needle. And then we started to do the advocacy to change the directly observed treatment protocol because it was actually a hindrance to being able to treat people with TB.
You know, earlier on, I accused you of being arrogant, and now I'm accusing you of the opposite. I think you are being too modest, because what you just articulated, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but perhaps I will have to, is that you have innovated an idea, and that is that the poor and most vulnerable deserve to be at the front of the queue to benefit from science and technology and the latest innovation, not at the end of the queue, which is a normal practice in our humanitarian and development world. And I think that is really what we mean by humanitarian principles. Get to the poorest and vulnerable first. That's MSF humanitarian ethics. And congratulations for that. Now, let's come to another area which is close to your heart, sitting where you do. Napoleon soldiers marched on their stomachs. And I have to say, having served with some French peacekeepers, they had excellent food. So pure humanitarians march on the logistics backbone. And I can vouch for that also, having been trapped in an MSF hospital in the Nuba Mountains with the Sudanese Khartoum regime bombing. And I'd run out of my personal supplies of insulin because my stay was prolonged against my will. And so your logisticians love the challenge of figuring out how to send a drone with the insulin to me deep in the Nuba Mountains. Now you're the head of MSF's Global Operations Center. How do you manage the complex transport, storage, and distribution, especially time-sensitive medicines, diagnostics, nutrition supplements across difficult borders?
Well, luckily, logistics and supply experts are professionalized and form a core part of our organization. We have several large logistics centers that have everything that we need pre-stocked, some built into kits. So there's a special kit for 100 wounded or a special kit for 1,000 cholera patients that they can send and ship pretty much anywhere at a moment's notice. But that, of course, comes up against hard states, importation, sometimes weather. If you know well, Sudan, trying to move things in the rainy season, for example, can be a heck of a challenge. So we overlay that then with our regional supplies. We're trying even to make that supply chain more green, which also makes it cheaper by preemptive view on a year of supplies in certain areas so that we can rely more on shipping than last-minute emergency charter planes. And we try hard to order things in advance. We know in certain areas that cholera, malaria, malnutrition may be cyclical. So in those areas, we will pre-ship a certain amount of supplies. We also have a weather tracking and information management system that allows us to have predictive abilities. So we can decide where do we send more people, where do we send less, where do we send more supplies less. In Somalia, there was a locust infestation, and it looked like it would wipe out all crops, and they could predict through different kind of atmospheric and other things which line of locust was likely to go where. And through that, you could actually gamble on pre-positioning food in a certain location over another when supplies are limited. We use also data analytics in South Sudan on malaria. We know 3 months in advance where we're going to have a high level of hospitalization. And there we pre-train, have supplies linked up. And the last example in Chad, with the hundreds of thousands of refugees that came across from Sudan, water provision became such an issue. And we had to rely on pumping water from the aquifer. But the aquifer only replenishes about 1% to 4% a year. So if you overpumped, you would deprive the community and end up with a problem long term. So to meet Sphere's standards of 20 liters a day, we were at about 5 at the beginning. We had to decide, are we going to pump 15? How many liters a day to not have epidemics on our hands, to have a decent medical care, but not to do environmental damage? And this system was able to show us how much we should pump from which aquifer so that we didn't end up with an environmental disaster on our hands.
Coming to matters of security, I'm struck by the poster behind your head about attacks on healthcare. Unfortunately, my experience of being bombed in a MSF hospital in Sudan is not that novel. In fact, that's happened more recently in terms of attacks on hospitals in Darfur and Kordofan, where I was, in both places. And around the world, unfortunately, many MSF workers have given their lives. So apart from condemning these as war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law, which no one listens to, what can you do operationally to mitigate risks?
Well, on that side, we've professionalized our negotiation and our security. Those are ongoing conversations we hold with parties to conflict to ensure our teams will not come to harm, and that if there are insecure routes or areas where active conflict will occur, that we're at least warned not to be at whatever location at the wrong time. It actually works quite well, but as you've pointed out, it's not without challenges. And sadly, we're seeing now in a number of conflicts from Gaza to Ukraine to Sudan, where there's almost a normalization of attacks on civilians, on civilian water points, hospitals, and ambulances. In such situations, if we see that that attack has been a collateral of the conflict, we review our principles and keep working. But if that attack has been premeditated or directed targeting MSF, we will make a decision to withdraw or not, or to try to figure out a way to deconflict. And one of those big examples was in Kunduz, where the U.S. military, with helicopter gunships, repeatedly strafed a high-functioning surgical center. that was well identified when you talk about the norms of humanitarian law with both sides of the conflict. A known location, we treated over 15,000 very impactful surgical cases in that facility. And after being multiply strafed, we lost 42 patients and staff in one night. It was a horrendous tragedy. We demanded accountability from the US, from the Taliban, from others. We withdrew and closed, which was very painful, I think for about 2 years before we could have enough security guarantees to believe that we would be able to conduct our activities in a safe manner for our patients and our staff.
I remember that tragedy in Kunduz, absolutely. And also Tigray, where you had workers killed. The other side of this health conflict coin is health as a bridge for peace. And the idea goes that medical work heals enmities, promotes collaboration, and the values of healthcare are the values of peace. But critics argue that peacemaking is a political project, while health humanitarian work is supposedly neutral. So does MSF think linking health and peace is good or bad, helpful or unhelpful?
Well, as the example earlier around Afghanistan, we are not in favor as MSF of any assistance being instrumentalized for some other kind of aim, even if it's a good aim, because we don't believe we'll be able to carry out our activities safely, effectively, and independently if we tie ourselves to a political project. I've studied peace and conflict resolution, so I understand the links, and that may be appropriate for government assistance or development aid. But you know the old adage on how hell was paved with the very best intentions. And often we see that we don't seem to have the staying power of these great ideals. And peace is a very fickle, and if you're not going to bring it in a way, truly inclusion of all parties and communities, if you're not going to have the staying power, if you don't have the tools, the buy-in, the coming to grips with everything that happened before through truth and reconciliation or other means, then it's very challenging to get to a positive and a lasting peace. So we don't judge others' initiatives. In fact, we would hope them well and hope that they succeed. We just won't instrumentalize our own offering of health.
A very cautious and uncharacteristically diplomatic answer, Steve. I have to confess I'm one of the pavers of not just roads, but highways to hell, because I was a big donor of WHO's Health as a Bridge for Peace program in the early years in Bosnia, for example. But I don't hear much about it nowadays, maybe because we are more realistic about such things. But it does bring us to the question of peace in the form of your Nobel Peace Prize, 1999. Your president of that time, James Orbinski, gave a passionate acceptance speech in Oslo. It's difficult to know, honestly, how to interpret it, because it's full of so many qualifications and caveats around the humanitarian security political linkage, and you hinted at that yourself. And Orbinski also served as MSF's head of mission in Kigali and notably asked for military intervention to end the 1994 Rwanda genocide. In fact, we were both there at the same time. And as a Nobel laureate, you are in the good company of people like Prime Minister Abiy of Ethiopia, waging brutal war in Tigray, or Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar, denier of the Rohingya genocide. And just a few weeks ago, Maria Machado, an admirer of Trump's military intervention in Venezuela, also got a Nobel. Now, with such companions in the elite club to which you belong, my question is whether MSF would accept the Nobel Peace Prize now if it was offered again.
Well, that's a great question. The first time around, I was in Peru up the Amazon River with a medical program bringing assistance to the Shipiba, an indigenous tribe. And one of the boatmen came and congratulated me on winning the peace. And I had the darndest trying to figure out what the heck he was talking about. I was still young in the organization and I had no understanding of why we would accept it. But if you look at the notoriety the organization received, the welcome into places like the UN Security Council or government officials, that probably would have been much more challenging had that not happened. The notoriety has certainly helped with our fundraising, certainly helped strengthen our voice when we have something to say. And we used the funds from that Nobel Peace Prize to start the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative. And that initiative partnered with universities, governments, funded startup, and continues to be funded, co-funded by ourselves, has even worked with Big Pharma that we love to criticize in recuperating the IP rights on promising treatments that were left aside, and brought a number of pediatric and other treatments to diseases that were left behind by the first world economics. So actually pretty good outcome. Now, would we do it again? I don't have the answer, but I read a very interesting article on the goods and the bads of the Peace Prize. And I wonder, but when we'd accepted, Kissinger had already won one, but it didn't block our decision because some perhaps less deserving subjects had been awarded the peace. I think all in all, it was very helpful for MSF. I would think there are more deserving candidates than MSF now. I would actually hope that if the choice was between giving the Peace Prize to MSF versus giving it to the Sudan doctors, that the Sudan doctors would win. I think there are far more local capacities, far more engaged humanitarians, credible people, people standing up for democracy and freedom at the risk of their own lives all around the world. I would hope that the next time around they choose someone that can inspire us all to a more peaceable future.
I'm sure the debate will continue. I just wonder whether humanitarians should get peace prizes because of all the linkages. Maybe there should be a Nobel Humanitarian Prize. But in any case, I'm really hoping that the Nobel Committee will offer you another peace prize, if only to have the pleasure of watching you refuse it. Coming to the end of our conversation, of course, we can't do that without talking Gaza. A lot's been said about Gaza, and I know you are under orders now to leave the Strip. So I want to ask you another dimension to tap a bit. We all know problems. Tell us something positive from your experiences. Is humanity alive, well, and defiant in Gaza?
We have between 1,100 and 1,200 Palestinian staff in Gaza and a few hundred more in the West Bank, many of them having been displaced multiple times, having lost multiple members of their family, many of them living in submerged tents and ramshackle shelters. And they get up every day to go to the hospitals, healthcare centers, water points that we're able to operate. And they do so with dignity, humanity, and care for everyone else. We worry about their health and try to encourage them to take holidays. And they're like, that's not going to help me to stay home. Then I'm just going to think about this conflict, how it will never end. But if I come to work, then I'm helping my fellow citizens and I'm bringing some humanity and some empathy and care. You know, taking action brings hope. Taking action in community brings a quality of life. The activities, they've been so difficult. We've lost 15 direct staff members. They've lost dozens of their family members. We have supply challenges. The list goes on, and you know all of this. But within all that, our one little organization that's limited on how much we can bring and how many staff, we could do so much more if we were able. We're supporting 20% of the hospital beds in Gaza. 1 in every 3 delivers is assisted by someone from our organization. We've treated over 100,000 patients and over 800,000 outpatient consultations here. That's just this year. So we are able to bring a little bit of humanity, and we try to make that everyone's responsibility, to what I've told you before about our supporters and the places where we live and work from. Here, in partnership with the government of Switzerland and WHO, we managed to airlift 20 critically injured children, 76 of their family members, for specialized treatment, care, and follow-up asylum. And every act of care matters. And that should be a mirror also to ourselves, to bring our own empathy, our own decision makers to the table to do something about this horrendous situation in Gaza, because it's way beyond our control, and our leaders better be looking in the mirror because they own this for either negligence or for cooperation.
Indeed, although as MSF you can't say it, I can say it, which is that what you've described are examples of humanitarianism as acts of resistance, defying inhumanity by the sheer act of practicing humanity. To another topic, in between your MSF roles, you directed the David Suzuki Foundation, environmental group in Canada. And now, of course, in the climate change era, the health of people and the planet is all tied up together. Doctor humanitarians who are brought up to revere human life now have to trade that off against revering planetary life. So what happens to the humanitarian business then, Steve, when the relief of human suffering and disease is no longer the absolute consideration because of wider planetary concerns?
So first, I'd say that it took us at MSF, and it took most doctors, a long time to realize that the climate crisis is a human health crisis. And this, despite communities and patients we work with telling us for well over a decade that their livelihoods, they can't guarantee them in the fields and in their farming methods because they can no longer trust the weather, or that severe drought followed by severe Rainstorms have washed all the crops away. We've seen diseases start to emerge and spread into new areas that they were never present before, like dengue. And this recurrence of natural disasters in certain places in Mozambique, speaking with the communities, they're like, I've lost my house twice already this year. If I lose my house again, there's no way I'll be able to recover and to rebuild it. It took us a long time to square that circle, because until then it had been, well, yeah, that is a big problem, but that's somebody else's problem. And our problem is to bring urgent life-saving assistance. But when doing so, you could ask yourselves, can we do a bit better? Can we leave the system a bit more resilient or strengthened to be able to overcome next time? And we found the answer to that to be yes. If we put solar panels in our missions in South Sudan, it saves money on fuel for the generator. It allows the healthcare system to work independently when access is cut off. If we look at our single-use items and reduce masks and gloves, we have no difference in medical care, but we've saved buying, using, and destroying them. We've expanded that concept of what it means to be do no harm. The medical, including humanitarian sector, is about 7% of carbon. And we have to be responsible, in a sense, but our red line is we will not save a life in order to save carbon. That is somebody else's job. But we will try to act responsibly, and we do need to ensure that we're able to work and respond to tomorrow's emergencies. And dengue is a good example because we've trialed a new way of dealing with dengue. So we're not spraying that doesn't last very long, that damages and pollutes the waterway, but releases a mosquito that has a gene that doesn't allow it to carry dengue. So the whole food chain still works the way it should. Water sources are protected. It's still somewhat controversial. It still costs too much, but just like HIV/AIDS, it's a new toolkit. Perhaps we can find a way to reduce the cost and introduce new kits, new cooperation, new ways of working in a climate-affected world.
Fascinating. This is a whole conversation by itself, but tragically, our conversation must come to an end. But I don't think you are done yet. You wrote a few years ago a short, poignant piece about living in harmony. You're looking very shiny and well-polished, sitting there talking to me. But I know there is a restless in your soul. So, Steve, what's next for you?
I don't think I'm done yet. It would be lovely to find that balance, and I probably haven't been that good at finding it. It's a little difficult to live such a vocation and to find balance and harmony. I hope to take a little time to reconnect with nature, community, and others, but I still believe that my vocation should drive me. And as long as I'm able, if I can continue to reduce suffering, both for people or planet, I'd be thrilled to continue giving it a try.
Sure that wherever your journey takes you, it'll be one of meaning, passion, and challenges, both for yourself and those around you. Stephen Cornish, thank you for being my most resolute guest on Fading Causes.
Thanks so much.